Joining me, Ibrahim Al-Marashi. He is a associate professor of history at California State University, San Marcos. Written a couple of pieces in Al Jazeera about, or at least one, about the sort of the genesis of the Wagner Group. Now, we may be seeing the end of it too at this moment. Not the least of it because there are sort of competitors within the sphere of Russia. But will you just walk us through? I remember Blackwater. I don't know what they're calling themselves today. They were Jay at one point, and God knows how they've rebranded themselves now. But tell us a little bit about Blackwater, and then we'll get into how this sort of formed the template and why for the Wagner Group.
So if we want to actually go for the template of mercenaries, I would actually trace it back to South Africa, around when the Cold War was winding down and the apartheid regime was winding down. A group called Executive Outcomes was formed, and that was former South African mercenaries. And I think Blackwater followed that template, which Wagner followed, is when you have kind of demobilizations of militaries around the Cold War, whether it's South Africa, the US, or the Soviet Union. You have these kind of professional salaried killers now looking for kind of a new income. And that's where the mercenaries stepped in. With the peace dividend after the Cold War, these guys needed a new income and livelihood.
And the use, though, because South Africa did not use their mercenaries as in the same way that the United States used Blackwater. That's like there's the template. I mean, mercenaries have been around for a long time. The idea that it becomes sort of corporate was developed with those, and it's a funny name, sort of, I guess, with that executive group. But the way in which a government uses these mercenaries, this is a relatively new phenomena.
And it's a way to skirt public opinion. It's projecting soldiers over a vast distance to make it easier for these governments to wage wars without any kind of public accountability. Now, public accountability in the US and Russia might be different, but still at the end of the day, neither government likes to report deaths of uniformed soldiers. So whether it's both in the US and Russia, there was kind of attempts, of the kind of coffin coming back draped in the flag to kind of hide those images. The contractors make it easier because you don't have to report their deaths. And in the case of the US, you didn't have to give them a wide range of benefits, whether it's, veteran administrations, kind of disability, so on, Social Security, so on and so forth. So in both cases, you're right. It's the template of making war easier, whether it's for Moscow or Washington, Blackwater or Wagner. It allows you to do the logistics of war a lot easier without any kind of public scrutiny.
At one point, we had more mercenaries, and we should say they're not all fighters in this situation, but just like not all military personnel are fighters, right? I mean, there's all sorts of like support staff and whatnot. We had more mercenaries, paid mercenaries in Iraq than U.S. Military personnel.
Correct. So for every combatant, usually there was this kind of unofficial figure. You need 3 people to support that person going into combat. And that's been the result of modern warfare, is that you always needed this kind of support staff, logistics, feeding, housing, so on and so forth. So you're correct. Not all mercenaries are combatants. But yes, at one point, there were more mercenaries than uniformed soldiers. And keep in mind, a lot of the other advantage of having mercenaries is you don't necessarily always have to hire, let's say, Americans or your nationality to do that support work. So that a good number of the mercenaries who outnumbered U.S. Uniformed soldiers also came from foreign countries, in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And in terms of like the way that, the value of mercenaries to the United States, we also didn't have the same sort of like domestic implications, right? In terms of like when the mercenaries get killed, and domestic within where they're fighting, localized, and in terms of like the United States responsibility for human rights violations.
So yes, correct. So in terms of domestically, it's a way of bypassing Congress. It's a way of bypassing the public in general. And with that problem is chain of command. Because this was a kind of gray area, so that when you had a massacre of Iraqis in 2007 at a traffic intersection. The Iraqi government was shocked to realize there was nothing in place to try those members of Blackwater for that massacre, just because this was being governed by the Coalition Provisional Authority, some clause that they issued in the early phase from 2003 2004 that made them immune.
So, what is there any type of like statutory authority for the U.S. government to hire mercenaries? Are there any constraints? Are there any, is there like a statutory allowance? I mean, because in the context, and I want to switch over to, how this sort of contrasts with the value of these mercenaries to someone like Putin, but in the context of the United States, like, do we have a system or like any type of statutory processes in which we sort of say like, hey, wait a second, we're not allowed to hire all these people. And we don't even know how many died within the context of the so-called, like within Iraq or in Afghanistan, or we also don't know how many we're employing today, do we?
So the question you ask is a good one. And in response to the Vietnam War, the Abrams Doctrine was developed by an American general precisely to have a tripwire, not allow a mass mobilization of Americans that got the U.S. into the mess of Vietnam, so that a mass mobilization of Americans would require, approval by the U.S. public. It was called the Abrams Doctrine. That was about it. Otherwise, there's really nothing governing the mass mobilization of mercenaries. The only thing that governs them is that they could potentially lose their contract with the person who hires. And that's about it. But a lot of times these mercenaries were hired with kind of no bid contracts, so on and so forth. So there's really nothing in place to govern their mobilization or their behavior once deployed.
All right, let's talk about Wagner and what was the value of the Wagner Group to Russia, and where it seems like most of the work was happening, at least now, once Ukraine was sort of taken off the table. The more prominent work was happening in Africa. Mm-hmm. Like it seems like almost like the Wagner Group became a de facto, like the military for, I don't know, I guess it's like Mali and a couple of other countries in Africa. What's the value of that to someone like Putin?
So Wagner became kind of an expeditionary force in the beginning that in places, let's say, Central African Republic, Mali, they restore security in exchange that Wagner then goes from becoming an expeditionary force to become what we would call a warlord network. And warlordism is just basically an extractive relationship between men in failed governance, in failed states where governance has collapsed. A warlord provides security in exchange from extracting. Now, extracting could be bribes from the population for protection, kind of a racket, or extracting blood diamonds, oil. That was the model that's set up in Africa. But it originally served as an expeditionary force in Syria. And the benefit to Putin was it offered plausible deniability. Putin never even acknowledged Wagner existed. It served as an expeditionary force when Russia wanted to support a renegade general in Libya. So it offers the benefit of plausible deniability. Then it offers extracting resources that goes back to these, networks back in Russia. So in the beginning, a lot of advantages in terms of not being accountable to the public, and then the financial, the actual accrual of revenues. Those were the two immediate advantages in the beginning.
So what happens now? I mean, does the Russian military have the ability to pay in the way that the Wagner Group did? Does it have the ability to sort of? I mean, I don't have a sense of like, what it was to serve in the Wagner military versus the Russian military. But I would imagine there's a cultural difference on some level, right? And that like will these mercenaries sort of reject Russian authority, military authority, or will they just be like, okay, I got to switch jobs. I have a different boss, and the coffee breaks at a different time. I mean, how big of a change is it? And will the Russian military absorb, I guess, the Wagner Group?
So you have the remnants of the Wagner Group, but then you also have a lot of other Russian mercenaries that just keep a lower profile. Wagner was a very high profile organization. In fact, they even made films to promote their activities. Their Telegram channel had a lot of subscribers, so on and so forth. The mercenary model is still in Russia. I think what the various mercenary companies in Russia that were not Wagner learned their lesson. Keep a low profile. And the other part of the bargain is the Russian state will still benefit from the use of mercenaries in terms of plausible deniability. Other people who are kind of guns for hire in Russia will still probably seek out the mercenary companies because they pay more. And usually these are veterans who have military experience who would want a higher paycheck than the regular Russian military, that wouldn't want to work under the chain of command of the Russian military. So the mercenary model is still there. I think the Prigozhin's very public execution in the sky is kind of a lesson to those mercenary bosses to keep a low profile, and that you still keep the bargain with Putin there. As for what happens with the remainder of the Wagner forces, that is still, I think, a question everyone is asking now.
Interesting. Well, Ibrahim Al-Marashi, Associate Professor of History at California State University, San Marcos, will link to your piece in Al Jazeera. Really appreciate your coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.